From WXIA TV in Atlanta, this is your Weekend in Depth.
Hello and welcome to this edition of 11 Alive News Weekend in Depth. I'm Dennis O'Hare. This morning we examined the war in Iraq. Now more than a year into the rebuilding process, and still we are fighting. There are daily reports of soldiers killed or injured in the line of duty. Is this the influence of someone like Al-Qaeda, or is this just a country that does not want our help with reconstruction? Even though the date for handing over sovereignty is June 30th, the U.S. will remain in the country, securing the Iraqi people. And how will that affect the outcome of the presidential election in November? Or will the reason why we went into the war in the first place be a factor? After all, we still have not found those weapons of mass destruction. And today we're having a roundtable discussion on Iraq. Joining us, our political analyst Bill Crane with the GCI Group. And we've also invited back two of our experts on Iraq who've been with us before, Dr. Michael Herb, a Georgia State professor who specializes in Middle Eastern studies, and visiting professor from Georgia Tech's Sam Nunn School of International Affairs who specializes in arms control, terrorism, and WMD preparedness, Dr. Bill Hain. Thank you all for being here. It's good to have you.
Pleasure.
Dr. Herb, let me start with you. We were talking about just why is this constant sort of struggle going on despite the fact that President Bush over a year ago now declared mission accomplished. Are we looking at a country that really doesn't want us there, or is this, as many of both the military and political people from the administration are saying, is a dedicated, fiercely determined group, a minority, who are keeping everybody else in fear?
Well, I think a lot of Iraqis are not sure that they want us there. This reminds them of British colonialism. On the other hand, many are willing to put up with us for the short term, but others are not.
Well, the question, and I think the bottom line question that always comes up when we hear whether it's a military or political briefing is, are they better off than they were under Saddam? And the answer always comes, yes, of course they are. That's not an issue at all. Or is it on the ground in Iraq?
Well, I think most Iraqis think that they're better off without Saddam, but the question is whether or not they like us there, and whether or not they think that our motives in removing Saddam were, to advance their interests or to advance some other interests. And so they, while they're happy that Saddam is gone, they'll also be happy when we're gone as well.
I would just jump in and say I don't think too many people in the world are really happy with occupying forces. I mean, the little thing called the American War of Independence started because we weren't real happy with the British, and we were their colony at the time, sitting in and telling us what to do, and we felt we were ready to become a sovereign nation. I think if we look ahead to June, and we're still where we are, and the elections and the transition of power don't occur, then we have a true situation where we're basically trying to pull out of the country step by step and true anarchy breaking out. What we have now is a mixed situation. And having talked to a lot of journalists who've just come back last week when I was at the Radio Television News Director Association convention, they're saying that there is really a mix in the Iraqi people opinion. And there are several instances where they talk to family members, and even a family of 4 or 5 people will have varying degrees of happiness with Saddam Hussein being gone, a free and open society, open markets and commerce, but they're not happy to see U.S. militia standing there and carrying machine guns, even though they do feel a certain element of safety.
Yeah, the other piece of the problem, I think, is their expectations were way too high for the speed with which we would be able to reconstruct things and so forth.
Did we make a mistake, do you think, Dr. Hain, in imposing by ourselves? I mean, this was our date that we put on there, that June 30th deadline for turning over sovereignty.
I don't think the administration realized when they set that date exactly how much of a challenge would still be remaining. Here we are 2 months away from that. But I think they're pretty much stuck with it. They're going to have to do something symbolic at the very minimum to suggest a transition of whatever power we can convey to whomever.
Before we even get into that, those are two big questions, but before we even get into that, let's look at that decision itself. Was that a military, tactical, logistical decision to impose that date, or was that strictly a political one? In other words, we'd be out of there, in the thinking at the time anyway, we'd be out of there well before the elections.
Yes, I think that was the principal hope, that we would in fact be able to reduce the troop commitments and that we would be able to point to an Iraq that was on the way to some sort of visible economic recovery. And I think a lot of that simply has not occurred because of the continuing turmoil and the lack of security in many of the big cities.
In that region, there is no truly democratically elected government of any of the surrounding countries. There is no experience in that population with having a democratically elected government. I think there's a distinction to be made to the viewers between freedom and a republic or a democracy. And it's awfully, I mean, even in Hong Kong right now, the Chinese government is wrestling with its transition agreement with the Republic of Hong Kong and the British government, and the United States is raising hackles because of what was talked about there in terms of a transition of power.
I think actually,
and if you even look at the Panama Canal treaties, we're not entirely happy with the turnover and the resulting government there. So creating out of whole cloth a democracy is a pretty tough challenge, no matter who.
Well, let me jump in for just a second, because I wanted to bring up sort of the next point in all this, and Bill is sort of alluding to this. We're trying to put something together, and yet we're increasingly, despite the continuing reference to the coalition, we are seeing people leave. Spanish troops left this week. They will have a logistical contingent there still, but their military folks are now gone. And just this week, Senator Chuck Hagel, who's a member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, said, we have to take the U.S. brand name, as he put it, off of our effort in Iraq, off of our reconstruction. That brings up the question, Dr. Hain, of where do we go from here in terms of internationalizing this effort, which is what we really need to do by June 30th when everybody's leaving. Well, not everybody, but certainly some of our major partners are having either departures or second thoughts. Yeah,
and there are a couple of other countries that have announced that they may indeed be withdrawing their even smaller troop commitments. So the current coalition is made up of really a lot of very small countries, and those who we would really need to be contributing to both stabilization and reconstruction are still pretty much sitting on the sidelines. And the problem is, without being able to provide basic security for aid workers and so forth from these other countries, I think it's going to be very difficult to attract an international contingent when the situation is as unsettled as it is currently.
Well, let's take a look at a Survey USA Today poll that we conducted that'll give you an idea of how some Americans look at all of this. We asked 500 Metro Atlantans, when should the U.S. hand over power to the Iraqis? And 49% say, let's hand it over on that designated June 30th deadline. But 45% of those polled feel power should remain with the U.S. until the country is more stable. 6% are not sure. Dr. Herb, we're going to have to go to a break real quickly, but let's at least begin exploring the questions raised by that poll and the ones we talked about before. To whom do we hand over sovereignty, first of all? And part of the problem is a lot of the people with the experience are the Baathists, the people that we didn't want there in the first place.
Well, I think first it's important to realize that not a whole lot appears like it's going to change on June 30th. The really important date is next January, when elections will be held, because the United States will retain a lot of the sort of important aspects of sovereignty, and there will be an appointed government of some sort in Iraq after June 30th. So really, I don't know that in the eyes of Iraqis that things are going to change all that much on June 30th.
What about the eyes of Americans?
I think that depends on the military situation.
The breaking news events of the day. I mean, again, remember, 40 years after, 50 years now after Korea, we've still got troops at the border. In West Germany, until these last two wars or conflicts, we had the most troops built up in the world were still in West Germany and in North Korea or South Korea at the North Korea border. So peacekeeping requires a commitment as well.
And we're going to take a look at that in our next segment as we'll look at the political ramifications of not finding those weapons of mass destruction in Iraq and the political ramifications of staying there. And will the wars in both Iraq and Afghanistan be on the minds of American voters when they choose a president in November? That question and more when we return.